Hello, everyone. Hope you're all having a great day. Today, we're going to explore a powerful and emotional story that asks one difficult question. What would you do if the person you love was fighting for her life, and choosing her meant standing against your own family? As illness, pressure, and impossible choices collide, James must decide whether love is worth risking everything. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any upcoming videos. James stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, staring down at the city below. Traffic moved the way it always did, busy, loud, relentless, but inside him, there was an unsettling emptiness. It was strange how a place so full of life could feel so distant at the same time. Tonight was supposed to be special. It was meant to be the night that changed everything. For months, James had planned every detail carefully. He wasn't the type to act on impulse. In business, in life, he believed preparation was everything. And this moment, inviting Diep fully into his life, was no exception. He wanted it to be right. He wanted it to feel certain. But before he could take that step, there was one obstacle he couldn't avoid. His father, Mr. Juan. To the outside world, Mr. Juan was a self-made man, a figure of authority who had built an entire empire from nothing. To James, he was a presence that carried weight. Every word measured, every decision calculated. Mr. Juan believed life should be evaluated the same way he evaluated business deals, through benefit, status, and long-term stability. And Diep didn't fit into that equation. She came from nothing. No family backing her, no education that impressed anyone, no connections that could be leveraged. To Mr. Juan, she was never an option, not even close. That afternoon, James walked into his father's office knowing there was no easy way out of the conversation ahead. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken tension. The walls were lined with awards and framed photographs, visual reminders of a life built on discipline and sacrifice. Mr. Juan didn't look up immediately. "So," he finally said, his voice low and cold, "are you serious about that girl?" James took a slow breath. "Yes, I am. I love Diep." The words landed between them like something fragile, easily crushed. Mr. Juan let out a quiet, dismissive laugh. "Love?" he repeated. "And what does that give you? What does she bring into your life? Her background? Her connections? Or a future that won't hold you back?" James clenched his hands at his sides, grounding himself. "I don't need any of that," he said evenly. "I only need her." Silence followed, long and deliberate. Mr. Juan finally raised his eyes, sharp and assessing, as if he were studying a risky investment. "Do you understand what choosing her means?" his father asked. "Your path won't be easy, and if one day you regret this decision, don't come back asking for support." James lifted his head, his voice steady despite the tension tightening his chest. "I understand, and I accept that." That was all he said, and that was all that needed to be said. That evening, James arrived at the restaurant where everything had already been prepared. The space looked exactly as he'd imagined. Soft lighting, elegant decor, a quiet sense of anticipation lingering in the air. It should have felt exciting. But something was wrong. Diep wasn't there. Minutes passed, then more. James checked his phone again and again, trying to ignore the unease creeping into his thoughts. And then suddenly, his phone vibrated. The message was short and devastating. Diep collapsed. Her condition is very serious. For a moment, James couldn't breathe. His heart seemed to stop altogether. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and ran, leaving everything behind. Plans, expectations, the future he thought he had under control. The hospital room was painfully white, sterile in a way that made everything feel unreal. Diep lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Machines hummed quietly around her, marking time in slow, unforgiving beats. The doctor explained that her illness had been developing silently for a long time. The symptoms were subtle, easy to overlook, until it was nearly too late. If she'd arrived any later, the outcome could have been irreversible. James sat by her bedside, unable to look away. Watching the woman he loved fight for her life shattered something inside him. Guilt hit him hard. Why hadn't he noticed sooner? Why had he been so focused on convincing his father, on planning the perfect future, that he hadn't seen how exhausted Diep really was? When Diep finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was James, still holding her hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn from days without real sleep. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to put pressure on you." James shook his head immediately. "Don't apologize," he said softly. "You've never been a burden, not even for a second." Diep turned her face away, tears slipping silently down her cheek. "You could have an easier life," she said, "without me." James leaned closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Without you, that life wouldn't mean anything." From that moment on, James practically lived at the hospital. Work was put on hold, meetings went unanswered, calls from family were ignored. Nothing mattered more than being there when Diep opened her eyes, when she struggled, when she needed reassurance that she wasn't alone. One day, his phone rang again. It was his father. "What are you doing?" Mr. Hawan asked bluntly. "Are you really prepared to give up everything for one woman?" James was quiet for a few seconds before responding. "I'm not giving anything up," he said. "I'm protecting the person I love." There was no reply on the other end of the line. Deep's condition slowly stabilized, but the road ahead was uncertain. Recovery wouldn't be quick or simple. No one could promise what tomorrow would bring. Sitting beside her bed one evening, James held her hand and spoke quietly. "I can't promise things will be easy," he said. "But no matter what happens, I'll stay. I'm not going anywhere." Diep looked at him, her eyes unsteady but filled with trust. "As long as you don't leave," she whispered, "I'll find the strength to keep going." And in those long, uncertain days, James finally understood something he had never learned from business or ambition. Some choices in life can't be measured by logic, benefit, or right and wrong. They can only be answered with the heart. And he had made his choice. The nights at the hospital were the hardest. During the day, James could distract himself, talking to doctors, reviewing test results, answering urgent emails he couldn't postpone forever. But at night, when the hallways grew quiet and the lights dimmed, reality crept in. The steady beeping of the monitors became louder somehow, each sound a reminder of how fragile everything was. James sat in the chair beside Diep's bed, jacket draped over the backrest, tie long forgotten. He watched her chest rise and fall, slow and shallow, as if even breathing required effort. Every time she stirred, his body tensed instinctively, afraid that something might be wrong. He had built companies worth millions. He had negotiated deals that determined the fate of hundreds of employees. Yet here, in this small hospital room, he was completely powerless. Sometimes Diep would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, her eyes searching the room until they found him. "You're still here," she would murmur. "Of course," James always replied. "Where else would I be?" She never argued, but there was always a flicker of guilt in her expression. James could see it clearly. She hated being the reason someone else had to pause their life. One evening, when her strength had returned just enough for conversation, she finally said it out loud. "You don't have to stay like this," Diep said softly. "Your life, your work, your family, they're important." James smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "You are important," he answered. "More than all of that." She looked away, swallowing hard. "Your father won't accept me," she said. "You know that." James nodded. He did know. "He may never," he admitted. "But that doesn't change my decision." Diep was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I don't want to be the reason you lose him." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not losing my father," he said calmly. "I'm just no longer living my life by his rules." The truth was, James had spent years trying to meet expectations he never chose for himself. The hospital forced him to confront something uncomfortable. All the success in the world meant nothing if the person he loved wasn't there to share it. Meanwhile, Mr. Hwan watched everything from a distance. He received reports through assistants, through mutual acquaintances, through brief updates he never asked for directly. He knew James hadn't returned to the office. He knew major decisions were being delayed or handled by others. And he knew exactly why. To Mr. Hwan, it looked like recklessness. One afternoon, unable to stay silent any longer, he came to the hospital himself. James was standing at the nurse's station when he saw his father walking down the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "This is where you've been hiding," Mr. Hwan finally said. James didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding," he replied. "I'm here." Mr. Hwan glanced through the glass window into Diep's room. She was asleep, her face still pale but calmer than before. "So, this is the choice you made," his father said quietly. "Yes? You're risking everything you've built." James turned to face him fully. "No," he said. "I'm protecting what matters." Mr. Hwan studied his son's face, searching for doubt, for hesitation. He found none, only exhaustion and resolve. "You used to think differently," Mr. Hwan said. "I used to think success was enough," James replied. "I was wrong." The conversation ended without resolution. Mr. Hwan left the hospital just as silently as he arrived. But something had shifted. For the first time, he realized this wasn't a phase. It wasn't rebellion. It was a line James was willing to stand behind. Days turned into weeks. Diep's recovery was slow and unpredictable. Some mornings she felt stronger, hopeful even. Other days, the pain and fatigue returned without warning, dragging her back into silence. Through it all, James remained constant. He learned how to read her moods without words. He learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to simply hold her hand and let time pass. In those quiet moments, Diep began to open up in ways she never had before. She spoke about her childhood, about growing up without anyone to rely on, about learning early that expecting help only led to disappointment. "I'm used to being alone," she said one evening. "That's why this scares me." James tightened his grip around her fingers. "What scares you?" "Needing someone," she admitted, "because if I lose you, I don't know how I'll stand back up." James didn't answer right away. He waited until she looked at him. "Then don't lose me," he said. "I'm not planning on going anywhere." For the first time since she fell ill, Diep smiled. Not weakly, not apologetically, but genuinely. Outside the hospital, life continued. Deadlines waited. Investors grew impatient. Rumors circulated about James stepping back from leadership. Some called it a mistake, others called it a weakness. James didn't care. What he learned during those weeks was something no business school ever taught him. Presence mattered more than control. Being there, truly there, was the strongest decision he had ever made. Eventually, the doctors delivered cautious optimism. Diep could leave the hospital soon, though her treatment would continue, and nothing was guaranteed. When James helped her pack her belongings, Diep hesitated. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "About everything?" James met her gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, after settling her into a quiet apartment away from the noise of the city, James stood by the window once again. The view looked similar to the one from his office, but he felt different. He no longer felt empty. He felt grounded. Behind him, Diep rested on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, breathing peacefully. James watched her for a moment, then allowed himself a small, relieved smile. He didn't know what the future would bring. There would be challenges, resistance, uncertainty. But one thing was clear now. Some choices don't ask to be justified. They ask to be lived. And James was ready to live with his choice, fully, honestly, and without regret. James is a successful man who believes he has control over every part of his life. until love and illness force him to face a choice he can't plan his way out of. As he prepares for an important night meant to mark a new beginning with Diep, everything changes when she suddenly collapses and is rushed to the hospital with a life-threatening illness. At the same time, James must confront his powerful father, Mr. Juan, who strongly opposes the relationship and sees Diep as a liability rather than a partner. While Diep fights to recover, James puts his career and family expectations on hold, choosing to stay by her side despite pressure and uncertainty. Through fear, guilt, and quiet moments in the hospital, James learns that some decisions cannot be measured by status or success, only by the heart and the courage to stand by the one you love.